There is a version of World War I that most people carry around without ever examining it too closely. It involves muddy trenches, heroic charges, poppies in fields, and a kind of tragic nobility that softens the whole thing into something bearable. It involves poets and letters home, and the idea that even in the worst of it, there was meaning being made somewhere. That version is not entirely false, but it is carefully selected. It has been trimmed and shaped over more than a century by governments, by schools, by memorials, by the quiet consensus that some truths about industrial warfare are better left unspoken, because once you say them plainly, once you lay them out in sequence without ornament or apology, the war stops looking like a tragedy and starts looking like something far more disturbing. It starts looking like a system that worked exactly as designed. What follows is not a corrective to the romantic version so much as a replacement for it. These are things that happened, things that were documented, recorded, filed, processed, and in many cases officially denied or reclassified for decades. Things that soldiers experienced not as extraordinary horrors, but as the routine texture of their days. The unsettling part is not that these realities existed. Wars produce atrocity. That is not new. The unsettling part is that they were treated as normal, not reluctantly normal, not guiltily normal, simply normal. As in, this is how things are done. As in, fill out the form and move on to the next case. As in, the numbers are within acceptable parameters. By 1914, European civilization had spent roughly a century congratulating itself on its progress. Industrial output, medical science, legal frameworks, democratic institutions, global trade networks. The machine had been perfected. And then the machine turned. And what the machine produced in the next 4 years was not the quick, decisive conflict that generals on every side had promised their governments. What it produced was a methodical, bureaucratically managed process of converting human beings into casualties at a rate that had never been achieved before in recorded history. And the most remarkable thing about that process was not the scale of it. The most remarkable thing was how quickly everyone involved learned to treat it as ordinary. The first reality that was treated as normal was the gap between what soldiers were told and what they arrived to find. Recruitment in Britain in 1914 proceeded on the understanding that the war would be short. The phrase "over by Christmas" was not propaganda exactly, not in the formal sense, because it reflected what many military planners genuinely believed. A short, violent resolution. A matter of months. What men arrived to find instead was a static front line stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. More than 400 miles of dug earth and wire and mud, and the immediate, unambiguous reality that they were not going to advance, that no one was going to advance, that the war was going to stay exactly where it was for reasons that no officer was prepared to explain in plain language. The gap between expectation and reality was enormous, and yet within weeks of arriving most men simply absorbed it. They stopped expecting the war to move. They started living inside it as a fixed condition rather than a temporary one. That adjustment, that silent, rapid normalization is worth pausing on, because it was not a small psychological feat. It was the first of many compressions that the war required of the human mind. The second reality was the trench itself as a living environment, which it quite literally was, because the trench was alive in ways that no official communication ever adequately conveyed. The trenches of the Western Front were not the neat, dry passages that appear in diagrams. They were structures built by exhausted men in whatever soil was available, frequently waterlogged, frequently collapsing, reinforced with whatever materials could be scavenged. In sectors like the Ypres salient in Belgium, the water table was so high that you could not dig down more than a few feet before hitting standing water. Men built upward instead using sandbags, and the result was a parapet rather than a proper trench, which offered less protection and required constant maintenance because sandbags rot. The water that could not be drained had to be stood in. Men stood in water for days at a time, not hours, days. And this was not an emergency condition. This was the baseline. This was Tuesday. The ground in these sectors was a mixture of clay and organic material that had the consistency of thick paste when wet, which it almost always was, and which had a suction effect on anything pushed into it. Boots, artillery shells, bodies. Things sank. Things disappeared. The mud of Passchendaele in 1917, to take the most documented example, was not a metaphor and not an exaggeration. Men and horses and equipment were genuinely swallowed by it. There are first-person accounts of soldiers watching comrades disappear into shell craters filled with liquid mud and being unable to reach them in time, and of the sounds that accompanied that process, and of having to continue the advance because the orders had not changed. The mud was logged in medical reports as a contributing factor in thousands of deaths. It was also simply the landscape. It was where the war took place. You adapted or you did not. The third reality was the rats. This sounds almost comedic when stated plainly, which is part of why it was so rarely communicated in official reports. The trenches were inhabited by rats in numbers that defy easy comprehension. Not a few rats. Not rats as an inconvenience. Rats as a dominant ecological presence. The reasons were straightforward. The front lines were defined by the presence of decaying organic matter, human and animal, and rats are extraordinarily efficient at exploiting exactly that kind of environment. They bred without interruption. They grew large. Soldiers reported rats the size of cats, which is an exaggeration, but not by much in some cases, because sustained access to protein-rich food sources produces large, healthy rats. The rats ate the dead. They also ate the living, or at least they nibbled at sleeping men, at exposed skin, at the contents of packs and ration bags. They moved through the trench systems at night in numbers that men described as rivers of movement, a constant dark flow along the duckboards and the walls. You could not eliminate them. You could kill individual rats. The population simply absorbed those losses and continued. Men developed a grim tolerance for them. Some kept them as pets. Some made informal competitions out of killing them. All of this was treated as a standard feature of trench life, something you mentioned in a letter home, the way you might mention bad weather. The rats are bad tonight. Not much else to report. The fourth reality was the lice. Every soldier on the Western Front had lice. Every single one. There were no exceptions. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in the fabric of uniforms, in hair. They could not be eliminated under field conditions because the eggs, called nits, survived most of the interventions available at the time. Men learned to run a candle flame along the seams of their shirts, which killed the visible lice and hatched the eggs simultaneously, producing a brief, nauseating crackling sound that veterans described with a kind of bitter expertise. The process was called chatting in British slang, from a now archaic word for louse. Men did this together. It became social. A group of soldiers sitting in a dugout, running flames along their clothing, talking, the crackling of lice eggs providing a steady background texture to the conversation. This was normal. This was an evening. The lice caused more than discomfort. They were vectors for trench fever, a bacterial infection that produced high fevers, severe pain in the shins and eyes, and a debilitating illness that could last for weeks. The cause of trench fever was not definitively identified until later in the war, and even after it was understood, nothing could effectively be done about the lice populations that spread it. Soldiers simply got it. They recovered or they did not, and those who recovered returned to the same conditions that had made them ill in the first place. The fifth reality was the smell, which sounds trivial and is not. The olfactory environment of the trench was something that veterans identified consistently as one of the most psychologically persistent aspects of the war, something that followed them home and triggered involuntary recall for decades afterward. The smell was a compound of things: decomposing flesh, both animal and human waste, which was managed inadequately at the best of times, the chemical smell of explosives and propellants, the specific smell of wet wool and mildew that saturated every piece of clothing and equipment, the smell of the mud itself, which in sectors where bodies had been incorporated into the earth had a sweetish, sickening undertone that men learned to identify immediately upon arrival and never forgot. Afterward, medical officers noted this smell in their reports. It was categorized and documented. One officer described the Ypres salient as having a smell that reached you before the trenches became visible, a smell that announced what you were entering. And then you entered it, and within a few days you stopped noticing it consciously, which is how the human olfactory system works under sustained exposure. But stopped noticing is not the same as stopped being affected. The smell was present in everything. It was the background condition of the war. The sixth reality was the management of the dead, which was one of the largest logistical challenges of the war, and one of the least discussed. The scale of casualties on the Western Front meant that the conventional rituals of death, the retrieval of the body, the transportation, the funeral, the grave, could not be maintained at anything like the rate at which men were dying. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,170 casualties, of whom around 19,240 were killed in a single day. The infrastructure of death could not process that number. Bodies remained in no man's land, which was the ground between the opposing trench lines, exposed to weather and to the physical processes of decomposition. Bodies also ended up incorporated into the trench walls themselves, because the construction and reconstruction of trenches was continuous, and the ground through which trenches were cut was often already full of the unrecovered dead from previous engagements. It was not uncommon for soldiers to find human remains protruding from the walls they were reinforcing. It was not uncommon for a shell to uncover a body that had been buried for months, and to release the accumulated gases of decomposition in a sudden, violent eruption. All of this was documented, all of this was reported, and all of it was processed through a bureaucratic system that issued forms, that created records, that gave the management of mass death the texture of administrative routine. Graves registration units were established specifically to locate, identify, and record the dead. They processed thousands of bodies. The work was performed by soldiers who had been assigned to it as a duty, who filled out the paperwork and moved on to the next case, because there was always a next case. There was no end to the next case. The seventh reality was the problem of identification. The question of who had died, as distinct from how many had died, was a persistent and often unresolvable administrative problem throughout the war. Identity discs, the metal tags that soldiers wore to enable identification, were present but imperfect. Many soldiers had only one disc, which was supposed to be left with the body for eventual burial identification, but in the chaos of battle, discs were lost, separated from bodies, collected and then misplaced. The physical condition of recovered bodies frequently made visual identification impossible. In these cases, the paperwork simply noted that the remains were unidentifiable and assigned a grave marker that read, "Known unto God," a phrase that the Imperial War Graves Commission formalized. Approximately 1/3 of all Commonwealth soldiers who died on the Western Front have no known grave. That is not a tragic anomaly. That is what happened to 1 in 3 of the dead. Their families received a notification that their son or husband or father was missing, believed killed, and then nothing more. No body, no grave, no specific location. Just the phrase and the date and the unit and the space where certainty would have been. And after the war, those families were sometimes given a grave registration number that pointed to a collective memorial rather than an individual burial. And that was the resolution. That was the closure that the system provided. The eighth reality was the treatment of men who could no longer function, which was one of the areas where the gap between institutional response and human reality was widest. The psychological damage produced by sustained exposure to the conditions of the Western Front was not a mystery. It was visible, observable, medically documentable from very early in the war. The symptoms were varied. Paralysis, blindness, deafness, mutism, uncontrollable tremors, inability to stop weeping, inability to walk, nightmares severe enough to prevent sleep, inability to eat, sudden violent terror in response to sounds. The British Army called this condition shell shock, a term that originated with the theory that proximity to exploding shells caused microscopic damage to the brain through concussive force. This theory was wrong, or at least incomplete, but the name stuck, and it served a specific institutional purpose, because it framed the condition as a physical injury rather than a psychological one, which made it more legible to a military culture that understood broken bodies but had very little conceptual framework for broken minds. The problem was that not everyone accepted even the shell shock framing. Many senior officers regarded the condition as cowardice, as weakness, as a form of malingering, which is the military term for faking illness to avoid duty. And the response to that reading was not medical treatment. It was punishment. It was return to the front. It was, in some cases, courts-martial. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the war for offences that included cowardice and desertion. A portion of those men, an unknown but non-trivial portion, were almost certainly suffering from what we would now recognize as severe combat-related trauma. They were not cowards. They were broken, and they were shot by firing squad anyway, and their families were notified of a death by military execution in terms that carried shame rather than sympathy, and that shame persisted in some of those families for generations, and the British government did not issue a formal pardon for these men until 2006. 90 years after the war began. The ninth reality was the medical infrastructure's encounter with wounds that it was not prepared for. Military medicine had made significant advances in the preceding century, particularly in surgery and in the management of infection. But the specific character of wounds produced by the weapons of the First World War, artillery shells, high-velocity rifle rounds, machine gun fire, and later poison gas, produced injury patterns that pushed the available medicine well past its boundaries. Shell fragments in particular produced wounds of enormous complexity, jagged metal driven deep into tissue, carrying contaminated soil and clothing fragments with it, creating infection pathways that were difficult to access and difficult to clean. Gas gangrene, the bacterial infection of deep tissue wounds by anaerobic bacteria present in the heavily cultivated soil of the Western Front, killed men who had survived the initial wounding and who had received apparently adequate treatment. It killed them from the inside, and it smelled, and it was one of the things that surgeons in casualty clearing stations worked against continuously and often unsuccessfully. Amputations were performed not to save limbs, but to save lives, and they were performed under conditions of extreme time pressure, because the flow of wounded from the front lines was continuous and the available surgeons were finite. A surgeon at a major battle might operate for 40 hours without meaningful rest. The quality of surgical judgment under those conditions degraded, and the surgeons knew it, and they continued operating because the alternative was leaving men to die on stretchers outside the tent. All of this was documented in medical journals and official reports. All of it was treated as the operational reality of military medicine at scale. The 10th reality was the gas. Chemical warfare did not begin with the First World War, but it was industrialized during it, and the scale and variety of chemical agents deployed during the war represented something genuinely new in the history of human conflict. The first large-scale use of poison gas on the Western Front occurred at 2nd Ypres in April 1915, when German forces released approximately 168 tons of chlorine gas from pressurized cylinders, allowing the wind to carry it toward the Allied trenches. The effect on the men who received that cloud was immediate and catastrophic. Chlorine reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, which destroys lung tissue. Men drowned in their own fluid. The ones who survived described the sensation of the attack, the greenish-yellow cloud, the smell of bleach, the burning that started in the eyes and throat and moved downward, the inability to breathe, the collapse. The British and French forces who received that attack had no protection. They had been told gas attacks were not coming. The warning signs had been misread or disregarded. The result was thousands of casualties and a 2-mile gap in the Allied line, and a new category of weapon that both sides then spent the rest of the war developing and deploying. What followed was an industrial competition in chemistry. Phosgene, which was colorless and smelled faintly of cut hay, and was responsible for the majority of gas deaths during the war because its symptoms were delayed and men often walked away from an exposure only to collapse and die hours later. Mustard gas, which was not a gas at all, but a liquid that evaporated and then settled on surfaces and skin and caused blistering burns to any tissue it contacted, including inside the lungs if inhaled, including on the genitals and under the arms where skin was moist and warm and therefore more vulnerable. Mustard gas was a persistent agent. It contaminated the ground and equipment for days. It was not primarily a killing agent, it was a disabling agent. The intention was not to kill men, but to put them out of action, because a man who required medical care consumed more resources than a dead man. That calculation was explicit. It appeared in military doctrine. The designers of chemical weapons understood that a high ratio of wounded to killed was strategically advantageous. They engineered toward that outcome. They succeeded. The protective equipment evolved in response. Wet cloths, then rudimentary masks, then progressively more sophisticated respirators. By 1918, the box respirator issued to British troops was reasonably effective against most agents when properly fitted and quickly donned. The critical interval was the time between the onset of a gas attack and the moment when a soldier could get his mask on and sealed. If a man was asleep or confused or in the middle of an action or simply slow, that interval could be long enough to produce a severe exposure. Men trained obsessively on masking drills, the time it took to get the mask on measured in seconds, practiced in the dark, practiced under fire, practiced until the sequence was automatic. And still men were gassed, because the war was not a training exercise, and the conditions were never the conditions of a training exercise. Gas casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They were treated. Many were permanently damaged. Mustard gas blindness, even temporary blindness lasting weeks, was so common that the hospitals established to treat it had their own organizational systems. Rows of men who could not see, led around by orderlies, waiting for their sight to return or not return. This was a ward. This was an administrative category. This was normal. The 11th reality was the artillery, which dominated the war in a way that has no real parallel before or after, and which shaped everything else about how the war was experienced. The Western Front consumed ammunition at rates that seemed impossible until the industrial machinery of the involved nations was fully converted to produce it. And even then, there were periods of acute shortage that determined the outcomes of battles. The British Army fired approximately 170 million shells during the war. The French fired more. The Germans fired more than both combined. These were not precision weapons. Artillery in the First World War was an area effect weapon deployed at scale with the intention of saturating a geographic zone with explosive force. The theory was that sufficient bombardment would destroy defensive positions, cut wire, kill or stun defenders, and allow infantry to advance. The theory was tested repeatedly. It was repeatedly wrong, or at least incomplete, because the bombardment also destroyed the ground over which the infantry had to advance, converting it into a cratered moonscape that slowed movement to a crawl, and because defenders had learned to go deep, to build bunkers and dugouts that could survive even prolonged artillery attack, and to emerge when the barrage lifted and man their machine guns before the advancing infantry arrived. The barrage and the advance had a timing problem that was never fully solved. And so the infantry went out across the cratered ground and was met by machine gun fire from men who had survived the barrage, and the casualty figures were filed and the attack was logged as unsuccessful, and the staff officers noted the lessons and planned the next one. The sound of the artillery was its own reality. At the height of major offensives, the barrage could be heard in England. Literally, in England, across the Channel, the vibration of millions of pounds of explosive detonating in northern France was audible in Kent and Sussex as a continuous low thunder. Men inside the barrage experienced something categorically different. The sound at close range was not simply loud, it was total. It eliminated all other perception. It produced physical sensation, pressure changes, vibration in the chest cavity, in the skull. Prolonged exposure to heavy bombardment produced a condition that military medical officers noted as confusion, disorientation, inability to respond to commands, and which was sometimes classified as shell shock, and sometimes logged simply as shaken, and sometimes not noted at all. The artillery was also a source of a specific terror, different from the fear of bullets, because a shell arrived without warning. There was no time to react. The shell either hit near you or it did not, and there was nothing you could do about either outcome. Men described the particular psychological burden of this helplessness, of existing in a space where lethal force could arrive at any moment, and your actions had no bearing on whether it did. That condition, sustained for days or weeks or months, produced a specific kind of psychic damage that manifested differently in different men, and that the army processed largely as a problem of manpower management rather than as a medical or human phenomenon. The 12th reality was what happened to the body under artillery fire, which the official communications of the time and many subsequent histories chose not to describe in detail, because the detail was unbearable, and because the bearable version was already politically difficult enough. A near miss from a heavy artillery shell did not produce a clean wound. It produced fragmentation of the human body. The word fragmentation is clinical and almost neutral, which is why it was used in the reports. But what it described was the literal dismemberment of a person, the separation of limbs from torsos, the destruction of recognizable human form, the conversion of a living person into something that could not be identified as having been a person. This was not rare. This was the dominant mechanism of death on the Western Front. More men died from artillery than from any other cause. The men who survived near misses had to continue performing their duties in proximity to the remains of people they had known, sometimes people they had been speaking with moments before. They learned to perform this. They learned to move past it in the moment and to not think about it, but to defer thinking about it, to put it in a place where it would not interfere with immediate function, and sometimes that deferral held, and sometimes it did not. And when it did not, the result was what the medical officer noted as breakdown, or what the commanding officer noted as cowardice, depending on which of them was doing the noting. The 13th reality was the specific experience of the night, which in the trench system was a working period rather than a resting one. Most of the movement in the trenches, the resupply, the rotation of troops, the repair of wire and walls, the conduct of raids into no man's land, happened at night because darkness provided the only real cover from observation. Dawn was the most dangerous time, the period of stand-to, when every man was at his post with his weapon ready because it was the most likely time for an assault, the light returning, and with it the possibility of attack. Dusk brought another stand-to, another period of maximum alertness at the moment of maximum fatigue. Between those two periods of maximum alert, the night was spent in work and in the management of the trench itself, which was in constant need of maintenance. Sleep happened in whatever gaps could be found, in dugouts or in a seated position in the trench itself, broken by noise and by the cold and by the obligation to stand watch. A soldier on the Western Front was, for most of his time in the line, significantly sleep-deprived. Not occasionally, not during major operations only, but continuously, as a baseline condition for the duration of his tour in the trenches. The effect of sustained sleep deprivation on cognitive function, on judgment, on emotional regulation, on the ability to assess threat, was not formally studied during the war, but it was visible in the behavior of troops, and was noted, without analysis, in officer reports as listlessness or reduced alertness, or in extreme cases, incapacity. And in those extreme cases, the response was usually the same as the response to everything else: return to duty when able. The 14th reality was the rotation system, which is sometimes cited as evidence that the armies of the Western Front were not entirely indifferent to the welfare of their soldiers, and which did indeed provide some meaningful structure to the experience of the war, but which also contained its own particular cruelties. The British Army operated a rotation in which units moved between the front-line trenches, the support trenches behind them, and a reserve position further back, and then to rest billets some distance from the line. The system provided breaks from direct front-line exposure. It did not provide anything that could honestly be called safety, because the support and reserve trenches were within artillery range and were regularly shelled, and the roads between them and the rear areas were also within range and were also regularly targeted, and the rest billets were rarely far enough away to be genuinely safe. What the system did provide was the anticipation of relief, the knowledge that a rotation back was coming, and this anticipation had real psychological value. Men oriented their endurance around it. The date of rotation out of the line was something that was known and counted toward, and then sometimes it was cancelled because of an operational need. Sometimes the relief was delayed by days or weeks because of a developing engagement. Sometimes a unit that had been in the line for an extended period was committed to an offensive rather than rotated out because they were in position and a fresh unit was not yet available. These decisions were made at the staff level, in offices, by officers who were not in the trenches, on the basis of operational timelines and not on the basis of the physiological or psychological state of the men being committed. This was not exceptional. This was how armies operated. It is simply that the gap between where the decisions were made and where the consequences were felt was unusually vast in the First World War. The 15th reality was the experience of going over the top, which is the phrase that has survived from the war as a kind of compressed capsule of its entire experience, and which was used so often and is referenced so frequently in histories and memoirs that it has almost lost its specificity. Going over the top meant climbing out of the trench, usually via ladders that had been positioned against the forward wall, and advancing across no man's land toward the enemy trench. It meant doing this in the open, upright, in daylight across ground that had been cratered and wired, and that was covered by enemy fire. The British infantry on the Somme in July 1916 advanced in this way at a walking pace because the pre-attack planning had assumed that the barrage would have eliminated effective resistance and that a controlled walking advance in extended line would make it easier to maintain formation and direction in unfamiliar terrain. The resistance had not been eliminated. The men walked forward in lines and were met by machine gun fire and artillery, and they fell in lines. This has been described many times. What has been described less often is the immediate before of it. The minutes in the trench before the whistles blew, the seconds of waiting after the whistle had been heard. The physical and psychological experience of climbing out. Men described it in letters and diaries and in the testimony they gave to journalists and historians after the war. Some described a kind of empty calm, a dissociation, a sense of unreality that settled over them once the decision was made. Some described terror so acute it was indistinguishable from physical illness. Some described a feeling of inevitability, of simply doing the next thing that was required, of not thinking past the immediate action because thinking past it was not compatible with doing it. All of these responses were described in the first person. All of them were real. All of them were experienced simultaneously by thousands of men in different ways, and all of those men were processed through the same system afterward, regardless of how they had experienced it. The 16th reality was what the officers who planned these offensives knew before they ordered them. The casualty projections for major offensives were calculated in advance. They had to be, because the availability of medical facilities, the quantity of stretcher bearers, the capacity of the casualty clearing stations, all of this had to be set up before the battle began to receive the men who would be wounded. Those preparations were based on casualty estimates. Those casualty estimates were the output of a calculation that incorporated the length of front being attacked, the estimated strength of defensive positions, the weight of the preparatory bombardment, and historical data from previous engagements. The planners knew approximately how many men would be killed and wounded before the attack was launched. They planned around that knowledge. They issued the orders. The officers commanding those attacks also knew in general terms that significant casualties were expected, and they passed those orders down to the men under their command, who did not always know and were not always told. The distribution of knowledge about expected losses was asymmetrical throughout the chain of command. The men most at risk were frequently the men least informed about the scale of the risk they were about to take. This was not a secret conspiracy. It was standard military doctrine in all of the major armies of the First World War. Casualty acceptance was built into the planning as a variable. A certain level of loss was considered acceptable in exchange for a certain objective. The word acceptable was used in official documents. It appeared in staff assessments. It was a technical term, meaning within the parameters of the mission rather than compatible with any individual soldier's right to survive. But the word was the same word, and it was applied to human lives, and it was treated as an ordinary feature of military planning, because it was. The 17th reality was the specific cruelty of the wire. Barbed wire was among the most significant tactical technologies of the First World War, and it was not a new invention. It had been used in agriculture for decades, but its deployment in the context of industrial warfare, in quantities and configurations designed to stop and hold advancing infantry in the open while machine guns engaged them, produced a specific kind of death that became one of the defining images of the war. Men caught in wire could not move. They were held, sometimes in positions of extreme physical stress, in the open, under fire. They called for help. The men behind them could sometimes hear them calling. The men behind them could usually not reach them without becoming caught themselves. And so the calls continued until they stopped. And what that meant was understood and not spoken. And then there was paperwork. The 18th reality was the machine gun, and specifically what it was actually designed to do, which was not to kill individual targets, but to engage area targets. To fire continuously along a fixed line or across a fixed field, to make a specific geographic space lethal for any unprotected human being who entered it. The mathematics of machine gun fire against advancing infantry in the open are not complicated. A single well-sighted machine gun firing at its sustained rate of several hundred rounds per minute across a front of several hundred meters could engage the entire width of an advancing infantry section within seconds. Multiple machine guns in interlocking fields of fire could make any advance across a given area a geometrically predictable catastrophe. The defenders of the Western Front had multiple machine guns in interlocking fields of fire. The attackers knew this before they attacked. They attacked anyway because the strategic alternative, simply maintaining the existing front without attempting to advance, was not considered acceptable by the governments and general staffs directing the war. And so the attacks continued, and the machine guns engaged, and the casualty figures came in, and the numbers were noted and processed, and the next attack was planned. The 19th reality was the specific medical reality of trench foot, which sounds minor and was not. Trench foot is the result of prolonged exposure of the feet to cold water and wet conditions without the ability to dry, warm, and move them adequately. The initial stage produces swelling and redness and pain. Prolonged exposure without treatment produces a condition where the tissue begins to die, where the foot turns blue-black and begins to smell and eventually requires amputation. In severe cases, both feet. A man who loses both feet to trench foot has lost both feet permanently. He is not going back to the front. He is spending the rest of his life without feet. Tens of thousands of British soldiers suffered trench foot during the war. It was preventable. The prevention required regular rotation out of wet conditions, the ability to remove wet boots and socks and dry and re-warm the feet, the application of whale oil to the skin to provide some waterproofing. Some of these measures were implemented. They reduced the incidence. They did not eliminate it, because the conditions that produced trench foot were the baseline conditions of the trench, and the baseline conditions could not be fully remediated because the trench was the trench, and the trench was underwater. So men stood in water and developed trench foot, and some of them were amputated, and all of it was documented, and the forms were filled out. And the next rotation of men stood in the same water. The 20th reality was how the armies handled food and what the consistent inadequacy of military rations did to the bodies and morale of men over years. The caloric intake provided to soldiers in the British Army was theoretically sufficient, in the sense that the official ration tables, when followed precisely, provided enough calories for a man engaged in heavy physical activity. The reality of ration delivery to the front lines was a different matter entirely. Food had to travel from rear areas to the trenches through a system of communication trenches, carried by parties of men moving at night over difficult ground under sporadic fire, and what arrived at the end of that journey was frequently not what had left the rear. Rations were lost, damaged, mixed with mud, supplemented or adulterated, consumed by the carriers themselves because the carriers were also hungry. Hot food was a luxury because keeping food hot over the distances involved was nearly impossible. Men in the front lines ate cold tinned bully beef, hard biscuit, sometimes cold stew that had partially congealed. Tea was important beyond its caloric value because making tea, having hot tea, was one of the few available sources of warmth and of normalcy, and men went to significant effort to maintain the ability to make tea under conditions that made it genuinely difficult. The chronic inadequacy of food, not starvation but persistent insufficiency, produced men who were underweight, who were physically weakened, who were more susceptible to illness and to cold injury and to the physical demands of combat. And those men were used. Because there were not enough men who were fully nourished and rested and physically adequate to do what needed to be done, the men who were available were used as they were. The 21st reality was the British Army's response to the 1917 mutinies in the French Army, which reflected something important about how military institutions processed internal evidence of their own failures. The French Army in 1917 had been pushed to a breaking point by the failure of the Nivelle offensive, an ambitious assault launched in April 1917 that had promised a definitive breakthrough and had produced catastrophic casualties and no breakthrough at all. What followed was collective insubordination on a scale unprecedented in the French Army. Approximately half of the French infantry divisions on the Western Front experienced some form of collective refusal to attack, though not refusal to defend. The men were not deserting. They were not running away. They were refusing to participate in offensive actions that they had concluded were pointless and homicidal. The French military response was to classify the mutinies as a security matter, to prosecute ringleaders through courts-martial, to execute a number that remained classified for decades and that historians now estimate at approximately 49, and to simultaneously address some of the legitimate grievances: improving leave, improving food, reducing the frequency of futile frontal assaults. The mutinies were suppressed, and the information about them was suppressed along with them. The British Army was not fully informed of the scale of the French breakdown, though British commanders were aware that something had occurred. The strategic consequence was that the British Army had to absorb a disproportionate share of offensive action on the Western Front for the remainder of 1917, including the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, to relieve pressure on a French army that was struggling to hold itself together. British soldiers at Passchendaele did not know this. They did not know that the purpose of what they were being asked to do was in part to prevent the complete collapse of their allies. They simply had the mud and the fire and the orders. The 22nd reality was the institutional processing of grief, or more precisely, the institutional absence of any processing of grief, which is the more accurate description. The British Army did not have grief counselors. It did not have mental health protocols in any form that would be recognizable today. It had a system of notifications, the telegrams and letters sent to the families of the killed and wounded, and it had the medical apparatus of the base hospitals and the casualty clearing stations, and it had the military law framework for dealing with men who ceased to function within the system. What it did not have was any recognition that grief itself, the experience of loss, was something that happened to soldiers continuously and that had effects, that a man who had served for 2 or 3 years and had seen the deaths of dozens of people he knew was carrying a cumulative weight that the system had no mechanism for measuring or addressing. Officers wrote letters to the families of their dead soldiers. This was a personal practice, not a systematic one, and the letters were often formulaic because the officers writing them were also carrying their own weight of loss and often did not have the emotional resources to write anything but the standard phrases about duty and sacrifice and how he died quickly without suffering, which was frequently not what had happened, but was what was available to say. The families at home grieved in a context of censorship because the press was censored, because the letters from the front were censored, because the available information about what the war actually was significantly shaped by what the government needed people to believe about the war in order to maintain the supply of men and of political support for its continuation. What the families knew was what they were told. What they were told was not the whole truth. And the men who came home, if they came home, often found that the gap between what they had experienced and what their families could comprehend was so wide that they simply stopped trying to bridge it. They came home, and they were quiet. They did not talk about it. This was also normal. This was the outcome of a system that had processed their experience as military data and had provided no other framework within which to understand it. The 23rd reality was the experience of the non-Western soldiers, the men from the colonies and dominions of the British Empire and the territories of France and Germany who served in the war, and whose experience was shaped not only by the conditions of the trenches but by the additional layer of the imperial hierarchy within which they served. The British Empire mobilized approximately 2.5 million men from India alone during the war. Several 100,000 men came from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Canada and Australia, and New Zealand and South Africa, from territories across the globe whose populations were compelled by various combinations of legal obligation, economic pressure, genuine voluntarism, and imperial recruitment to serve in a European war whose causes and objectives were not always explained to them and were not primarily theirs. Indian soldiers at Gallipoli, African laborers in the Labour Corps, West Indian soldiers on the Western Front. These men encountered the racial hierarchies of the armies they served in as a daily operational reality. They received different pay, different rations in some cases, different accommodation when accommodation was organized by race. They were frequently commanded exclusively by white officers. Their contributions were documented in military records that simultaneously relied on their service and diminished their individuality. The casualty records for non-white soldiers are less complete than those for white British soldiers, partly for administrative reasons and partly because the administrative system treated them as less individual. Their memorials are fewer. Their names on those memorials are fewer. The categories through which the war was officially remembered were built around a version of the war that centered white British and Dominion experience, and that is the version that the commemorative culture of the 20th century largely inherited. The experience of the Indian soldiers at Neuve-Chapelle, of the men of the South African Native Labour Corps, of the Caribbean soldiers who were denied combat roles and assigned to labour despite their requests, this experience has been partially recovered by historians, but remains outside the mainstream understanding of what the First World War was. And that absence is also a fact about the war. The 24th reality was the condition of the men who survived. The war ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the guns stopped. And the men who were alive at that moment continued to be alive afterward. They went home. They returned to countries that had been changed by the war, that had lost some of their young men and had received back a portion of those who had gone, and what they received back was not what had left. The men who came back from the Western Front had spent years in an environment of extreme physical and psychological stress, had been subjected to the cumulative effects of cold and hunger and illness and noise and violence and loss, and they came back carrying all of that as a physical and psychological reality that had no official name for most of them, and no treatment and no social structure within which to process it. Some of them drank. Some of them could not hold employment. Some of them could not sleep. Some of them flinched at loud noises for the rest of their lives. Some of them never talked about the war at all and carried it in silence until they died. Some of them talked about it constantly and were not believed or not fully understood. Some of them held together and built lives and had families and appeared to function, and in some of those cases the appearance was accurate, and in some of those cases it was not. What the government gave them was a pension, in many cases inadequate, and a culture of commemoration built around sacrifice and duty, and the idea that the dead had died for something, and the cenotaph and the poppies, and the date in November, and for a significant portion of the surviving men, this was not enough, and was in some ways an additional insult, because the commemorative culture required the war to have meant something, and the meaning it proposed was not the one that the experience had produced. By 1939, many of the survivors of the First World War watched a second one begin, watched the machinery begin to turn again, watched the mobilization and the conscription and the posters, and they did not say much. They had already said what there was to say, or they had not said it because it had not been sayable, and now it was beginning again, and the forms were being filled out, and the trains were loading, and the numbers were being projected. Between 1914 and 1918, approximately 17 million people died as a result of the war, military and civilian. An additional 20 million were wounded. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, which spread along the military supply lines and through the populations of countries weakened by 4 years of industrial war, killed between 50 and 100 million more. The armistice of November 1918 did not resolve the conditions that had produced the war. It suspended the fighting while the peace treaty was negotiated, and the peace treaty of 1919, produced by exhausted and angry men in Paris, created the political and economic conditions that a generation later produced another war of comparable scale. The men who signed that treaty knew it was unstable. Some of them said so at the time. The process continued anyway, because the process had its own momentum by that point, its own bureaucratic logic, its own forms to fill out and objectives to achieve within the available timeline. The war that was supposed to end all wars ended in a document that contained the seeds of the next one, and the men who had survived the first one watched it develop, and the machinery turned over again, and the numbers were projected, and the trains were loaded, and everything that had been learned about the normalization of mass death was available to be applied a second time.